October 9th, 1942. 20,000 feet above a jungle-choked island called Guadalcanal, a young American pilot fought for his life. He was 22-year-old Marine aviator Marian Carl, strapped into the cockpit of a Grumman F4F Wildcat. Heavy, slow to respond, and built for toughness rather than speed, the Wildcat felt like a brick compared to its enemy. Below, the jungle sprawled in endless green. Above, the sky seemed calm. But Carl was not alone. A Mitsubishi A6M0, sleek, light, deadly, was on his tail. The Zero turned faster than anything Carl had ever flown, climbed like a rocket, and seemed to anticipate his every move. For months, the Zero had dominated the skies across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Carl was skilled, an ace even, but in that moment, he was nothing more than prey. He dove his Wildcat, the plane groaning as it picked up speed. The Zero followed, unshaken. Every maneuver Carl made, the Japanese fighter anticipated. Then came the hit. Cannon fire tore through Carl's cockpit, shrapnel slicing his leg. His controls froze. The Wildcat was falling. Somehow, he bailed out, plunging into shark-infested waters below. Survival felt like a miracle. This was Guadalcanal. This was the air war in the Pacific, chaotic, merciless, and deadly. And while Carl was lucky to live, the American pilots arriving on that island were walking into a meat grinder. Weeks later, another man would step into that same sky and change everything. Not a young hotshot, not a career soldier. A 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota. A man who had been told he was too old to fly in combat. A man whose life experience, not formal training, would give him the edge. His name was Joseph J. Foss. Foss wasn't born for war. He was born for survival. In 1915, he came into the world on a remote, unelectrified farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood wasn't shaped by classrooms or teachers. It was shaped by frost, dirt, hunger, and hard work. The Great Depression hit the farm like a storm of iron and fire. Crops failed, land dried to dust, and food was scarce. Foss's father taught him to hunt not for sport, but to eat. That's where Foss learned his first lessons in precision, patience, and calculation. When Joe was 12, hunting jackrabbits with an old shotgun, he learned something the military would later call deflection shooting. Rabbits don't run in straight lines. To hit them, you can't aim at where they are, you aim at where they'll be. Every shot required predicting movement, factoring wind, speed, and timing. It was math in motion. Foss didn't just become a marksman. He became a predator. Flying called to him early. At 18, he went to an air show with his father and watched Marine biplanes loop and dive overhead. That was it. He was hooked. But life, as always, had other plans. When his father died, tragically, Joe was forced to leave school and run the farm. Yet he kept pushing, taking night classes, working jobs, and saving to earn a pilot's license. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, Foss was 26, ready to fight, but told he was too old to fly combat missions. Rejected, he became an instructor instead. For 9 months, he trained young pilots, watched them fly into danger, and seethed with frustration. Then he found a way around the rules. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve, became a flight instructor, and never stopped pushing for combat. Finally, they sent him to advanced fighter training. He was headed for Guadalcanal. October 1942. Henderson Field. Guadalcanal. Foss stepped off the transport ship and into hell. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the stench of rotting jungle and burning engines. The runway was a strip of dirt and gravel, surrounded by palm trees. Around him lay wrecked planes, Wildcats with wings ripped off, P-39s with engines shattered, cockpits soaked in grease and sweat. The Cactus Air Force called it graveyard, and Foss realized just how lethal his new home was. He met the men he would fly with, hardened ghosts of war. Yellowed faces, bloodshot eyes, bodies fatigued by malaria and lack of sleep. They were veterans, but they were hunted. And now, here was Foss, a farm boy labeled too old, ready to join them. They saw him as new meat, another body to replace the ones they had lost yesterday. His assigned plane, the same model Marian Carl had flown, was a Grumman Wildcat. Slow, heavy, fragile in the hands of the Japanese Zero. The squadron's executive officer, Duke, briefed him with the same deadly doctrine: never turn with a Zero. Dive, shoot, run, survive. Foss listened, nodded, but he had a secret the doctrine didn't account for. The farmer's eye, trained for survival and precision, the ability to calculate a moving target instinctively. His first flight over Guadalcanal was not a practice run. It was a trial by fire. Flying at 15,000 feet, Foss scanned the sky. Then the call came over the radio: bandits, 11 o'clock high. Foss looked up to see a formation of Zeros diving. Faster than anything he had imagined, they plummeted toward him. His training screamed at him, dive and run. But he relied on instinct. He dove hard, shaking the Zeros off, his heart hammering with anger, not fear. Just days later, Foss encountered his first real fight. Japanese bombers, flanked by Zeros, appeared over the jungle. Dogfights erupted. Wildcats and Zeros twisted in deadly loops overhead. Foss saw a Zero lock onto his wingman. The instinct from years hunting rabbits kicked in. He didn't aim directly at the enemy. He aimed where the plane would be, firing at a patch of sky just ahead. The Zero, focused on its target, flew into his path. Wing torn, plane disintegrated, kill number 1. Foss had not outturned the Zero. He had outthought it. By the end of his first week, he had become the squadron's unlikely hero. His understanding of motion, prediction, and timing, things no manual could teach, had saved lives and given the Americans a fighting chance. And this was just the beginning. The man who had been too old, too untested, was about to transform the air war over Guadalcanal. The question now: could a farm boy truly change the tide of war, facing veteran Japanese pilots and planes far superior to his own? Or would the jungle, the Zeros, and the relentless Pacific sun finally claim him too? Tomorrow, we follow Joe Foss as he turns from rookie to ace, teaching an entire squadron the deadly art of hunting in the sky. October 13th, 1942. Just days after his arrival, Joe Foss led his first combat patrol with a squadron of 8 Wildcats. The Pacific sky was calm, deceptively quiet, until the glint of sunlight revealed the enemy. Mitsubishi Zeros, fast, deadly, circling above. The air was thick with tension. Every pilot knew that one wrong move could be their last. Foss didn't panic. He remembered the lessons of the farm, the jackrabbits, the instinctive calculation of movement. The doctrine said dive and run. But Foss's I saw opportunity. He ordered his flight to use a new tactic, one he would call the thatch weave, where pilots flew in pairs, covering each other's tails. He dove. The Zeros followed. Tracers zipped past his canopy, close enough to singe his skin with fear. Foss didn't flinch. Instead, he aimed at the empty space ahead of the Zero, not at the plane itself. He fired a long burst, 6.50 caliber guns tearing through the sky. The Zero's wing ripped off. It spiraled down, consumed by fire. Kill number 2. The squadron watched, jaws tight, eyes wide. Foss had done what no one thought possible. He had outthought the Zero. Not faster, not more agile, but smarter. The farm boy's logic had turned the tables. Over the next few days, Foss's confidence grew, and so did his reputation. On October 16th, leading 8 Wildcats into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft, he demonstrated what the press would later call Foss's flying circus. Outnumbered 4-1, Foss didn't hesitate. He called the shots, directing his wingmen, weaving his planes in perfect, deadly synchronization. The chaos of battle didn't intimidate him. It sharpened him. A Zero dove on a wingman. Foss didn't chase it. He predicted its path, fired ahead, and watched as it collided with a wall of bullets. Another Zero lined up behind him, expecting the Wildcat to turn, to panic, but Foss held steady. He executed a high side pass, rolling over the top, coming down from the Zero's blind spot, and fired a single perfect burst. Engine exploded. Wing shattered. Kill number 3. By the end of that day, Foss had personally shot down 2 planes, and his squadron had taken 5. The once defeated Cactus Air Force was suddenly winning, turning the air war over Guadalcanal on its head. But the Japanese were not blind to this change. Their veterans, once confident and ruthless, began returning to their carriers shaken, confused, pale. Reports came in that wildcats were no longer fleeing, they were hunting. And at the center of it all was Joe Foss, a man they had been told was too old, too slow, too inexperienced. Foss's skill didn't come from fancy training manuals or advanced doctrine. It came from the simple, brutal logic of the hunt. Every dogfight became a calculation, a dance of prediction. Each enemy maneuver was anticipated, each escape path accounted for. Foss treated the sky like a field where movement and timing were everything, just as he had done on the frozen plains of South Dakota, aiming at jackrabbits weaving across the snow. By late October, he had racked up 5 kills, earning his first A status. On October 25th, he shot down 3 Zeros in a single day. The farm boy was now the deadliest pilot on the island. His squadron, inspired by his tactics, became a coordinated killing machine, feared by the Japanese. But the war was unforgiving, and success came at a cost. On November 7th, Foss was leading another patrol when they were ambushed by elite Japanese aces. The sky became a maelstrom of twisting aircraft, tracer fire, and roaring engines. Foss shot down 2 Zeros, then lined up a third, only to have his plane ripped apart by cannon fire. His engine exploded. Smoke filled the cockpit. He bailed out over the jungle, shaken but alive. 2 days later, he faced another close call, this time over open water. A Japanese float plane's rear gunner shredded his engine. Foss had no choice but to ditch his Wildcat in the ocean, floating alone, tens of miles from shore in shark-infested waters. For 4 hours, he drifted, surrounded by circling predators. But he was a farmer, trained to wait, to endure, to survive. Rescue came, against all odds, when islanders paddled out to pull him from the water. He returned to Henderson Field, sick, exhausted, and feverish but unbroken. Within 2 weeks, he was back in the air. Fever, fatigue, and malaria couldn't stop him. Each sortie became a masterclass in prediction, timing, and fearless leadership. By January 1943, Foss's tally stood at 23 kills. He was 3 short of the all-time American record set by World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker. But unlike Rickenbacker, Foss was flying in a slow, cumbersome plane against superior fighters, and he was sick, burning with fever, each mission pushing him to the brink of collapse. Yet, he never hesitated. Every target became a calculated shot, every maneuver a farmer's instinct applied in the deadly skies of the Pacific. And then came January 15th, the day that would cement his legend. A massive Japanese naval convoy, protected by dozens of fighters, approached Guadalcanal. Foss, shaking from malaria but focused like a predator, led his squadron into battle. The sky erupted with twisting planes, tracer fire, and deafening engines. Foss moved instinctively, a Zero dove at his wingman. He aimed not at the enemy, but where the plane would be, anticipating the path. His bullets tore through the air, the Zero disintegrating mid-flight. Kill number 24. Another Zero appeared. Foss rolled over its blind spot, fired, and watched the engine explode. Kill 25. One more, a fleeing float plane, tried to escape. Foss calculated its trajectory, fired a precise deflection shot, and watched it tumble into the Pacific. Kill 26. In a single afternoon, fever-racked and exhausted, Joe Foss had tied, then broken, the all-time American record. When he landed, the base erupted. Ghosts of the Cactus Air Force lifted him from his cockpit, cheering, celebrating the farm boy who had become America's ace of aces. Yet the battle was far from over. The Japanese were furious, adapting, hunting, trying to understand the tactics that had turned the hunter into the hunted. But Foss had changed the rules. His deflection shooting, his farmer's instinct, his piano wire logic. It was now the new doctrine, the guide for every wildcat in the Pacific. Joe Foss had proven that courage, patience, and observation could triumph over technology. That an unassuming farm boy could outthink veteran pilots, turning the tide of a brutal campaign. But what price would he pay for such victories? Fever, malaria, exhaustion, and the relentless push of combat began to take their toll. The man who had faced down Zeros and sharks was now fighting an enemy within his own blood. And as his legend grew, the world would soon see the final chapter of this incredible story. The moment when a farmer from South Dakota would rise to the very pinnacle of American aerial combat, earning the highest honor a soldier can receive, and proving that the heart, more than the machine, determines victory. Next, we follow Joe Foss's ultimate triumph. The day he becomes America's ace of aces, the battles that test every ounce of his courage, and a legacy that would echo long after the war ended. January 15th, 1943. The morning was heavy with heat and humidity, the kind that seeps into bones. Joe Foss climbed into his Wildcat, each movement a battle against fever that left his muscles trembling. Doctors had told him to stay grounded. The island's malaria had returned with a vengeance, racking his body with chills and burning sweat. But Foss didn't care. The sky called him. His squadron, his flying circus, was counting on him. The Japanese were approaching, a massive convoy protected by scores of fighters, and he was the only pilot who could face it head-on. The air erupted the moment he reached 15,000 feet. Wildcats and Zeros twisted in a chaotic storm above the jungle canopy. Tracer fire laced the sky like fireflies in a hurricane. Foss's vision blurred, fever clouding his mind, yet instinct took over. He was not a man flying a plane. He was a predator in his element. A Zero dove at his wingman. He didn't chase. He anticipated. He aimed at the path the enemy would take, at the space where it would be, and fired. The plane's wing tore off. It spiraled into the Pacific. Kill number 24. Another Zero surged. Foss rolled, used the blind spot he had memorized from hundreds of flights, fired a perfect burst. The engine exploded. Kill number 25. One more. A fleeing float plane tried to escape. Foss's deflection shot, precise and cruel, met the cockpit midair. The enemy plane tumbled, disappearing into the water below. Kill number 26. In a single day, with sweat and fever baking him, he had tied, then broken, the all-time American record set by Eddie Rickenbacker. When Foss landed at Henderson Field, the base erupted. The ghosts of exhausted, haunted pilots lifted him from the cockpit, shouting, cheering. The farmer from South Dakota, the man they once thought too old, too fragile, too inexperienced, had become the deadliest pilot in the Pacific. He was America's ace of aces. The Japanese, meanwhile, were in disbelief. Their veteran pilots had always assumed the Wildcat inferior, the tactics simple. Now their confidence shattered. Reports flooded back. Wildcats no longer ran, they fought. They fired ahead of their targets, anticipating movement with deadly precision. The Americans were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. And at the center of it all was Joe Foss, a man who had never learned to fly from a manual, but from years spent tracking movement on frozen plains, calculating the path of a fleeing rabbit. But heroism comes at a cost. The fever and malaria, the endless sorties, the relentless mental strain, it had all been wearing him down. Days after breaking the record, Foss could barely stand. His body had become a battlefield of its own. Doctors shook their heads as he was evacuated, skeletal and yellow-skinned, his body consumed by illness even as his mind remained sharp and unbroken. He returned to the United States a national hero. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss stood in the White House as President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The nation celebrated the farm boy who had beaten impossible odds, who had flown an inferior plane and destroyed mythic enemy fighters, proving that courage, intelligence, and instinct could change the course of war. Foss's story, however, was never about the medals or the records. It was about grit, about seeing flaws that others missed, about using the tools at hand, whether a wildcat or a farmer's instinct, to survive and to win. The deflection shooting, the thatch weave, the precision and anticipation he taught others became standard doctrine across the Pacific, saving countless lives and turning the tide of the conflict over Guadalcanal. After the war, Joe Foss did not seek further fame. He returned to South Dakota, the same land that had shaped him, that had taught him patience, calculation, and resilience. He entered politics, serving his state in the legislature, and later became governor. He carried the same integrity, the same determination that had made him a legend in the skies, into every aspect of his life. He went on to serve as the first commissioner of the American Football League, earning respect in arenas far removed from the Pacific skies. But at his core, Joe Foss remained that South Dakota farmer, the boy who had learned to track rabbits across frozen fields, who had honed the eye and mind that would make him the deadliest pilot America had ever seen. His victories were not won through superior machines or fancy manuals. They were won through human instinct, intelligence, and courage. Joe Foss passed away in 2003 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, remembered not only as a hero of Guadalcanal, but as a man who exemplified what it truly meant to fight with grit, intelligence, and heart. His story, like those of other overlooked heroes of the Second World War, reminds us that wars are won not just by technology, but by people, by individuals who see flaws others miss, who act when others hesitate, and who fight with every ounce of themselves, even when the odds are impossible. This was the man who turned an inferior plane into the deadliest weapon in the sky. The farmer who outthought veteran aces. The teacher of the piano wire logic that would save lives. The ordinary man who became extraordinary. Joe Foss's legacy lives on in the skies he conquered, in the men he led, and in the doctrine he forever changed. From the frozen fields of South Dakota to the burning skies over Guadalcanal, from fear to triumph, his journey is a testament. Courage, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit can change history. And while the story of Joe Foss ends here, his spirit, his farmer's eye, and his relentless determination continue to inspire every pilot, every soldier, every person who dares to take impossible odds and turn them into victory.